Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to the Hidden Corners. To celebrate Rob Bauer's new book release, tonight we have a very special episode planned for you. A full night of Rob Bauer's stories. We'll start out with a brand new one from Rob called Snake, Rattle, and Row, followed by a retelling of The Pond Monster, The Thing in the Culvert, The Pond Stalker, and Bigfoot in Colorado. Rob's books are available on Amazon, so check them out. They're called What the Hell? Campfire Tales from Uncle Rob, Volume 1 and 2. I hope you enjoy the stories.
This is another wonderful Rob Bauer story. Snake, Rattle, and Row. Have you ever been at a farm pond or lake and noticed some areas that you really wanted to fish but just couldn't access? I'm talking about areas that are not accessible from the bank because of cliffs or trees or brush, cattails, some other kind of obstacle. Some of these areas may not be accessible by boat, even a small 1 or 2-man boat. Some folks can't afford a boat. Sometimes there is just no place to launch a boat if you had one. So what did you do? Did you stare and wonder at these inaccessible areas? Did you wonder or even fantasize about that huge fish that could be lurking out of reach of even the most pinpoint precision casts? Did you try to think like a fish? Did you think, if I was a huge fish, where would I hang out? I would likely lurk back in the areas where no fisherman could put a hook into me. After all, a huge fish didn't get huge by being dumb. Have you ever looked at those areas and seen fishing line and lures and red and white bobbers hanging from the trees and the cattails, just like ornaments on a Christmas tree? If you saw such evidence of so many previous fishermen's failures, did you rack your brain for a solution to just how you could fish these areas? Well, I did many times. I would gaze and wonder about the fish that I was certain were hanging out in those hard or even impossible to fish areas. I also contributed to the collection of lures and hooks and bobbers that hung in sad testaments of failure in these areas. Sometimes while staring wistfully of these areas, I could see evidence that confirmed my theory that big fish lurked in these areas. I could see a wake, a V cutting the water, a sure sign that something big was swimming just under the surface. Sometimes I'd see a swirl, like a huge toilet flushed. Sometimes I'd hear a splash, and when I looked towards the sound, I would see the ever-increasing ripples emanating from the central point where a huge bass attacked and took its unfortunate prey. All that is hard for a fisherman like me to take. My solution came unexpectedly one day. I was talking to my buddy Red about a pond that I had a few places I couldn't get to. Red suggested I get a fishing tube. A fishing tube? What the heck is a fishing tube? I had no idea. I asked Red to elaborate. Well, Red explained that a fishing tube or a float tube is basically a car tire inner tube, and the tube has a kind of a saddle inside of it with holes for your legs to hang through. With the tube lying on the ground, you step into the holes, then you pick the tube up and you walk into the water. The tube floats, of course, and it supports the fisherman who can paddle around into places that are not accessible from the bank. Red had one of those contraptions, and he let me examine it. It was indeed a car inner tube, and it had a canvas-type wrap around it. The inner portion had an adjustable saddle-like area with holes for legs to go through. Now, you need one of these, Red told me. I murmured as I looked that thing over. You'll need some fins, too, Red told me. Fins, I said. So you can move around, Red said. Like that explained it. I nodded my head like I actually knew what he was talking about. Red told me where he got his tube and what he thought he paid for it. We talked a bit more about the practicalities and advantages of tube fishing. I told Red I was going to look for one of the things. If it would help me fish some areas that maybe never or rarely fished, I was all in. It was kind of like a new fishing lure. Holding the lure while still in the package, you could imagine what the thing looked like in the water. What would it look like to a fish? Would fish hit the thing? And then the thought of the price enters the mind. Is this thing worth what they want for it? Usually, well, at least for me, the thought that prevails is, for that price, if it catches one big fish, it's worth it. As I left, I saw Red pat his tube with his hand, just like he was petting the family dog. Later, I thought Red had likely missed his calling. He maybe should have sold insurance or used cars. Hell, he could sell ice to an Eskimo. He sold me because after my next payday, I found and I bought one of the contraptions. Mine was fancier than Red's. My float tube had a cylindrical pad on the back, ideal for leaning back into. It also had a small zippered compartment in the front and a small tackle box that held 6 or 10 lures that fit nicely in the front pouch. I also bought some gadgets called duck fins. These gizmos fastened to my legs with Velcro straps just above the ankles. These things were my mode of propulsion. The thing had hinges on them. The idea attached to these things was all you had to do while using them was you moved your legs like you were walking on land. When the legs moved forward, as though you were stepping, the fin laid back against your leg. And then when the leg was pulled back towards the body, the fin deployed and caught water. It was like walking through water. At least that was the dog and pony show that I bought into. In reality, when I used the duck fins, I could barely move around at all. I would feebly kick around in a circle, but that was about it. All those crazy gizmos got me was wore smooth out. The duck fins got pitched into a corner. My next idea didn't pan out well either, at least at first. I bought myself a pair of frog fins, the kind that scuba divers use. They worked great while I was in the water. I could lean back against the backrest on my float tube and I could kick the fins, propelling myself through the water at a pretty decent rate of speed. The only problem was on the shore. If you've ever walked while wearing frog fins, or maybe you've observed someone walking while wearing fins, you'll know the problem. They're clumsy. You have to walk like a goose. The fins are so long that you have to really raise your legs high and roll your hips to take steps. If you didn't have to walk far, it wasn't so bad. However, many times when fishing a farm pond, the distance between where you can park and the water's edge can be really significant. Walking a great distance wearing fins wasn't a good idea. One of the first places I took my new float tube out was Fort Supply Lake. I tried it out in an area called Crappy Cove. The point where I planned to enter the water was lined with riprap. Now, climbing on riprap wearing frog fins was not a good idea. Climbing riprap with no shoes on was not a good idea either. There was no way I wanted to cross that riprap barefoot. Well, my solution was simple. I wore a pair of old shoes to cross the riprap. And once in the water, I took the shoes off and lay them on a flat rock within the riprap. I then put the fins in my feet and I proceeded onward. I had a fish basket with a floating lid with me. I used a short length of rope to tie the fish back and I towed the basket behind me. The first thing I discovered was the fact that Crappie Cove wasn't deep enough for me to really use the tube. Most of the time, the tube floated between my knees and my waist. I'm sure that everyone driving by noticed how intelligent I looked while using my new float tube. I did manage to catch 6 nice crappies, but the tube wasn't needed. I could have waited without that tube just fine. The real jolt to my adventure came when I got ready to leave the water. I made my way back to the exact point where I'd entered the water, and when I got there, I discovered my shoes were gone. I looked around the rocks. I looked in between the rocks, no shoes. Either someone else had stopped and noticed the shoes and took them, or a wave or wake had washed them off the rocks where I'd placed them. Now, the point was the shoes were gone. I had to take off the fins and climb the riprap barefooted. It was not a pleasant experience. A few days later, I hit upon the idea of cutting my fins down. So I cut about 3 inches off the ends, back towards the toes. This made walking while wearing them a lot easier and left enough of the fins to still propel me around at a decent rate. I was pretty happy with my whole setup after that. A few months later, I was in my float tube fishing a large farm pond that had some impossible fish areas. The pond had a large stand of trees in two parts of it. Now, to the west of the trees, the pond narrowed down between 10 and 15 feet high bluffs on both sides. Stands of cattails that were 7 feet tall lined the water's edge on the north end of the narrowed area. The south end had fewer cattails and some small brush at the water's edge. There was absolutely no way to fish these areas from the bank, but my float tube gave me access. Well, I fished along the trees for an hour or so. I caught 2 crappie and a small bass. The crappie got put into my floating fish basket that I towed along behind me. I also removed a few lures and some other tackle that was snagged in the trees. Now, most of the lures had been hanging in the timber for so long that the hooks were rusty. Well, I kicked my way over between the high bluffs and started fishing the cattails on the north side. I'd often wondered how deep the water was in that area. I discovered that it was deep enough that my dangling legs didn't touch the bottom. I figured the water would be shallower the further in I went. I'd only made a few casts when I heard a splash behind me. I cranked the tube around with a few kicks of my cut-off fins, thinking the splash I heard was a big bass. I reeled up my lure quickly and had my arm cocked for a pinpoint cast toward the ripples that I expected to see. I didn't see anything, at least not at first. When I did see movement, I wasn't sure what it was. I saw something moving on the surface. It was just in front of the cattails, and it was just below the highest point of the bluffs. I watched it as it moved closer. I saw a head come out of the water about 3 or 4 inches. It was a snake. I kicked my fins a few times, and the snake turned a bit and made straight for me. It must have detected my movement. Now, I'm not one who's deathly afraid of snakes, but I'm not in love with the things either. I don't like snakes, but if they leave me alone, I leave them alone. That said, there is something about snakes in trees and snakes in the water that kind of creeps me out. As the snake moved closer to me, I could see that it was a big one. I couldn't tell what species it was. There's a lot of water snakes in Oklahoma, and they come in all sizes. The snake was big, and it was swimming with its head above the water. Not the usual swimming posture for a typical water snake. I turned my tube and I lay back in, kicking my fins to move me away from the snake. But that snake kept coming towards me. It was like it was a missile homing in on me. It was soon evident that that snake was faster than me, and it closed the distance between us really quickly. When it got within 8 or 10 feet, I could see then this was a rattlesnake. A rattlesnake? In the water? All my life I'd heard that rattlesnakes don't like water. But I don't know if this one liked water or not, but it was in the water. Maybe it fell in the water off the bluff. Maybe it entered the water on purpose. I had no way of knowing. But it was in the water, and I was in the water. It was weird, I know, but suddenly the famous scene from the movie Jaws entered my head. As I frantically kicked away from the serpent, I heard the spiel and the song Quint sang to Hooper when he found out about that shark cage, substituting cage for tube and shark for snake. Tube goes in the water, you go in the water, snake is in the water, a rattlesnake. Farewell and adieu to you, fair Spanish ladies. Farewell and adieu to the ladies of Spain, for we've received orders for to sail back to Boston, and so never more shall we see you again. Funny are the things that flash through your mind sometimes. I had a spinnerbait tied on my fishing line. I reeled the lure all the way up to the rod tip and started whipping the water at the snake. I used my rod kind of like a buggy whip. I lashed the snake in the water into an attempt to chase or scare the snake away from me. I literally beat the water to a froth. I was also yelling at the snake to go away. I don't remember the exact verbiage I used, but I'm quite sure it was colorful. I may have even made up a few new cuss words. Neither the lashing nor the yelling resulted in chasing the snake off. It just kept coming. I kept cranking my head around to see what direction I was headed. I was making for a spot where I could exit the water. I would turn my head around to look, then look back at the snake, and resumed kicking and lashing with my rod and yelling. I made it to a point where I could touch bottom. I started hopping off the bottom backwards towards the shore. I found out this was a bit slower because the snake got very close to me, so close I couldn't hit it with my rod. I lay back and kicked some more. With my butt bounced off the bottom, I stood up. I backed up then, walking with the tube down around my knees. I stepped out of the tube and retreated up the bank a short distance. The rattlesnake came right up on the tube. It crawled right up on it. I looked around and I saw a large tree branch nearby. I picked up the branch and flipped the snake off the tube. The snake hit the ground and started to coil up and rattle its tail. I threw caution to the winds and started beating the crap out of the snake. My club broke, but I kept smacking that snake until I was sure it was dead. When I was sure that snake was dead, I tossed the club away. I stood there panting like a sled dog. The adrenaline rush was wearing off and I was shaking. The snake was over 4 feet long. I pulled my pocket knife out of my wet pocket and cut off the snake's head and its rattle. The snake had 11 rattles and a button. I kept the rattle. I still have it. I keep it in an old tackle box. The fishing tube or float tube I did not keep. I sold that float tube soon after. If I'd have been unable to sell it, I would have given it away. Snakes in the water with me, especially venomous snakes, was not an experience I wanted to repeat. The Pond Monster by Rob Bowers. Well, this event happened in the late 1980s or the early 1990s. I'm not sure on the exact date. A good friend of mine, his name was Red, and I stopped one day at a local service station on our way out of town to work. Another acquaintance of ours worked there. His name was Don. Well, Don was washing someone's windshield. I told you it was a long time ago. And he said hello to us as we entered the station for a cup of coffee. On the way back out to our truck, Don told Red that it was too pretty a day to be working and they should just say to heck with it and go fishing. To which Red replied, "Sounds good to me. Where should we go?" Well, Don replied, "Any place but Bingston's," and they both laughed. Red and I got in the truck with Red driving, and we headed out of town. That's when I asked, "What's wrong with Bingston's?" I always heard that's a pretty good farm pond to fish. "Oh, it is," Red told me, but Don said he saw a monster out there one night. Well, I laughed at him and I said, "A monster? Come on." "No, that's what Don said," Red told me. "Scared him so bad he won't go back out there." Seriously? I thought this was a joke and I was missing the punchline. "That's what Don said," Red told me again. "Well, what kind of monster did he see?" I asked, still not buying in. "A sea monster," Red stated. "A what? Get out of here." "Well, I guess it's a pond monster since it was in that pond," Red laughed. "But he says it looked like the Loch Ness Monster." "A pond monster?" Well, I didn't point out that Loch Ness is a lake and it's in Scotland, and this was a farm pond in Oklahoma. So I guess that would make it a pond monster, I thought, confusing myself even more. "So what happened?" I asked. "What'd this thing look like? Was it after dawn? What was it doing? How big was it?" I had a lot of questions, and now I wanted to get a look at this pond. "I didn't see it," Red told me, "but I was there." "Well, you were there?" I asked him. "How did he see it and you not?" Red laughed again. "You got to understand," he explained. This place is way out in the country. It has huge fish in it. Catfish mostly. Real rod benders. Well, now I wanted to see this pond even more. "Now, what are you doing after work?" I asked him. "Let's go." "Nah, we'll have to wait for a while." What have you got to do instead?" I asked him, thinking he had some chores lined up. "Well, we need to wait until well after dark." "After dark?" I asked. "Why? Do the big ones out there bite better after dark?" "I'm not sure I can find that place in the daylight," Red said with a smirk. "Well, now that doesn't make sense," I told him. "I've only been there twice," he admitted, "both times at night." "Okay, but still..." "Look," he said, "let me explain." "I wish you would," I told him, laughing. "Well, the old man that owns the place," he started off. Will he let us fish? I interrupted. Well, that's the thing, he said. The old man that owns the place won't let anyone fish. So you have to sneak on the place. At night. Oh, damn, I thought. I wasn't sure if I was cool with that. Sneaking onto some place without permission was not my thing. Well, this old man, Red continued, he feels these fish. He has names for them. They're like pets to him. At least that's what the guys say. If one of his fish turns up missing, he knows someone has snuck in and caught one. Word is, if he catches you, he foams at the mouth. They say he has shot at guys too. Wow. That's all I could think to say. Yeah, Red said, nodding in agreement. Years ago, Don and I snuck out there one night. We were after some of those big catfish. Well, we walked through the pasture and down the hill to the pond. The old man's house was up on the hill opposite the way we came in, so he could see part of the pond from up there. So we used no lights. We got down to the pond and we separated. I went one way down the bank, Don went the other way. Now, we'd been there about a half hour and we'd had no bites from any fish. All of a sudden I heard the darndest commotion, thrashing around and stuff in the weeds and the brush around the pond. I'm thinking either it's the old man because he's found us, or Don had a snake crawl up his leg. But here comes Don. It's dark and I can barely see him, but he comes, practically running. He's out of breath. Let's get the hell out of here, Don says, gasping. What? I ask, what's the matter? Is the old man coming? Come on, Don says over his shoulder as he's headed up the hill. We got back to the pickup and got the hell out of there. All the time I'm asking Don, what the hell? Did the old man see us? Well, he finally told me that he had seen a monster in the pond. Wow, I said to Red. Did he say what it looked like or how big it was? Nah, Red shook his head. Don said it looked like the Loch Ness Monster. It had a head and a neck sticking up out of the water. He won't talk about it, and he won't go back out there. That's weird, I said, wondering what he could have seen. Well, you still want to go? Red asked me. Hell yes, I told him. All this monster stuff had me excited. So did the big fish. I'm not scared. I want to go. Red laughed. I'm not scared either. I think Don got nervous that night and made that monster stuff up so I would leave with him. I've been wanting to go back there, but never did. Well, maybe we'll catch a few big ones. I was eager as hell, and maybe see this monster. Red chuckled. That night was years ago. If there was something besides fish in that pond, like a monster, it has to be dead or gone by now. I still want to go, I said firmly. Okay, I'll be by to pick you up around 11 tonight. Just bring one rod and reel, very little tackle, and a stringer. And bring something to use for bait, he told me. Oh, and bring a 5-gallon bucket if you have one. Okay, I agreed. What's the bucket for? To put your stuff in and to sit on, he told me, like that was a dumb question. True to his word, Red showed up right around 11 p.m. A small part of me wondered if he would be a no-show, kind of like a snipe hunt, with me left holding the bag, or in this case, the fishing rod and bucket. But I loaded my bucket and rod, and off we went. So what kind of bait did you bring, Red asked me. Well, I got worms and grasshoppers, I told him. Nice, he said. I got liver and shrimp. That makes us a nice variety. There's supposed to be huge largemouth bass there, too. I've got a little box with a few lures in it. I may give them a try, too. Well, sounds good, I told him. We drove for about half an hour. Suddenly, Red shut off his headlights. We're getting close, Red told me, and we don't want to take a chance of that old man seeing our headlights. Well, I was straining my eyes trying to see where we were when Red pulled over to the side of a dirt road and stopped. This is it, he announced. Well, we both got out and shut our doors quickly and quietly. We grabbed our rods and their buckets, and we crossed over the barbed wire fence. This way, Red said softly. Follow me. Well, we walked for about 15 minutes. We passed through some sagebrush and around some plum thickets. The moon was about half full. It was partly cloudy that night, and when the moon wasn't behind a cloud, and after our eyes became accustomed to the dark, we could actually see fairly well. At some point, we topped a rise, and Red stopped. The pond is down there, he pointed with his fishing rod, and way over there is the old man's house. Well, looking around, I could see below us the shine of the water in the pond and the dark spots of a few trees around the edges. Beyond that, and on a bit of a hill opposite us, I could make out a house and a few outbuildings. There was one yard light over there. It lit up a portion of the ground and a small part of the wall of the house. Well, Red took off down the slope towards the pond, and I followed him. We made it to the pond's edge, and there was some brush and tall weeds along the edge, and a few small trees. "There are some cattails over this way," Red whispered, "and I'm going over to them. Don't stray too far in case we have to run for it." And he moved off to my right. Well, I looked around my immediate area, and I found a clear spot on the bank. I baited my hook with a big grasshopper, not the easiest thing to do in the dark, but I managed it. And I made a cast. I thought it was about 50 feet out there. The grasshopper and the lead sinker hit with a plunk. I could just make out the expanding ripples, so I had a pretty good idea where my line was. So I sat my rod down, turned my bucket over, and I sat on it. I picked up my rod and, by feel only, took up the slack in my line. I waited. Well, that's what fishermen do. I waited for the tug of a bite. I wanted to set the hook on one of the big fish that were supposed to live in this pond. My senses strained to see and hear everything possible. My eyes constantly darted to the single dim light visible up on the opposite hill. I waited for maybe 20 minutes, and I had no bites. Then I heard something. I heard a splash. And then I heard a peculiar sound. It was a bloop, 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 bloop. What the hell is that, I wondered? Is that a fish, or was a turtle making that sound? The sound was out in front of me, but I couldn't tell how far. Then the sound faded away. Well, I heard it again. It was a gloop, 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 gloop. This time it was over in the direction Red had gone, maybe out in front of him. Was he making that sound? There it was again. Bloop, 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 bloop. I was straining my eyes to see and listening intently as the sound faded away again. Suddenly there was a rustle in the weeds, and Red was there, just a few feet from me. "Quit clowning around," he hissed at me. "What?" I hissed back. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here." "Are you making that noise?" he asked me. "No," I told him, and I thought that was you. "It's not me," he stated. "Not me either," I told him. "Well, cut it out," he said in a stage whisper voice, and turned back, and he disappeared into the dark. Well, he's messing with me, I was thinking. Well, it wasn't going to work. I was not going to freak out. Soon after, though, that sound come again. It was just that bloop, 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 bloop. And then a small but discernible splash. "Damn it, Red," I was thinking. "I know that's you." But then Red was there near me again. He had his bucket with him this time. He sat down close to me and cast his line out. He looked over at me and said softly, "Now do it, asshole." "Do what?" I whispered. "I'm telling you that is not me." Soon we both heard it again, and there it was. Bloop, 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 bloop. Now we both knew it was not the other person making the noise. "I thought that was you," I told him, "fishing some kind of topwater plug like a jitterbug or something like that." Well, I could barely see him, just shaking his head no. "No, I haven't even tried a plug on," he stated. "I thought that was you screwing around." "No way," I told him. Well, we heard it again. Bloop, 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 bloop. Both of us leaned forward, trying to see and hear something more. Suddenly, out in front of us, maybe 25 feet, we saw it. The moon chose that very moment to peek out from behind the clouds. The moonlight shone out on the surface of the pond, and there it was. It was moving from our right to left out in front of us, a head and a neck sticking up out of the water. It stuck up about 18 to 24 inches from the surface. The pond was calm. It was smooth as glass, in fact. There was no body visible, just a neck, and on top of that, a small head. The thing left a wake behind it as it moved along. The head was moving side to side a bit as it moved, as though it was searching for something, maybe something to eat. As it cruised by us, we heard that now familiar sound, that bloop, 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 bloop. The thing disappeared into the dark, and the bloop sound faded with it. We sat there stunned for a few moments. Then Red leaned real close to me and asked in a low voice, "You about ready to go?" Yeah, I answered. Well, both of us reeled in record time, threw everything in our buckets, and got the hell out of there. We spoke not one word to each other until we crawled over the fence. And when we put our stuff in the bed of the pickup, I asked Red, "What in the hell was that?" "Damned if I know," Red answered, "but Don was right. There is something in that pond." Well, Red and I discussed this event many times over the following years, and I recall that I was always the one who brought it up. We both agreed that it wasn't a water bird. It was too big to be a duck, and it wasn't a goose. When a goose swims by, you can clearly see its body. Well, we saw no body, just the neck and the head. We saw no feet or fins, and we saw no tail. We both thought it was something alive, and it was swimming, but its method of propulsion was a mystery. Well, we tossed around the idea that it was something the old man who owned the place had rigged up to scare away fishermen. But if that's the case, well, how did he do it? If it was indeed something rigged up to scare people away, I can say one thing for sure. It worked, because we never went back. Now, when fishing spots were discussed from then on, Red and I agreed, and Dawn too, I guess. We would fish any place but Bingston's. The Pond Stalker by Rob Bowers. This event happened at a farm pond. And yes, it's a true story. You may be thinking, another story with a farm pond as a setting? All I can say is I used to spend a lot of time fishing at ponds. Back when I was younger, there were ponds everywhere, and many actually held water and had good fish in them. Today, a farm pond that holds water and has good fish in it is a special thing because so many of our ponds have gone dry due to drought. Now, farm ponds have their own finite ecosystem. Fish such as largemouth bass, crappie, channel cat, and bluegill thrived in ponds. Ponds were also a stable source of water for animals, both wild and domestic, and sometimes ponds seemed to be places where weird things happened. They were, quite literally, where things went bump in the night. Now, the pond in this story wasn't a particularly big pond, but it was fairly good sized. It held a marginal population of bass, a great crappie population, and supposedly it held a few nice channel cats. A friend of mine named Terry and I decided we would do some night fishing at the pond. We wanted to see if we could tangle with some of the big catfish that were said to inhabit the pond. We'd already seined some crawdads and water dogs for bait. A seine is a large fishing net kept hanging in the water by weights and floats. But we'd gone out to a creek and cut some tamaracks. Our plan was to set some bank lines and fish from the bank with rods and reels. Well, we arrived at the pond just before dark and proceeded to set up for the night. We selected a nice spot on the bank where we set up. The main part of the pond was in front of us and to our right, and there was a large tree out in the water in front of us, with a few smaller trees scattered around the big ones. Lines, lures, and bobbers hung from the trees like Christmas ornaments, testifying to previous fishermen's misfortune. I myself had caught a few good bass and many crappie around those trees, but on this night our focus was catfish. We thought our plan was foolproof, especially so considering the bait we had with us. So we set 5 bank lines to our left. The pond narrowed in that direction and curved around to the left. The access to the water was partially blocked by brush and patches of cattails. We could only walk about 100 yards or so. After that, the area was too choked up with brush to go further. As we walked along the pond on our right, following a slightly worn cow path, the area to our left was a tangle of brush, tamaracks, and further backs a few medium-sized trees. There was a tall red bluff behind all that, and a few gullies and washes that cut back into the bluff. The cow trail that led back to this area was pretty well defined and meandered along the pond shore, occasionally rising up and down over small humps in the terrain. So we set our bank lines in places where the shore was open. The idea was that the fish could easily make their way up to the struggling bait in those places, so we set the lines so that the crawdads and the water dogs hung just below the surface. Any movement by the bait created little splashes and ripples. We thought this would be irresistible to any fish wanting an easy meal. And once we had our bank line set, we set up a sort of a camp. We gathered wood and built a campfire. We made cowboy coffee and had a few cans of beans that we heated up on a flat rock. We cast out a few rods with bait right in front of us. For extra light, we had a lantern and we had a flashlight. So the night was warm, it was pleasant, the sky was clear, and there was little to no wind. We sat at our campfire sipping coffee and talking. We talked about our plan and our setup. We were sure it was going to be a good night of fishing. Well, after a while, Terry remarked, "You know, this is the pond where that old man drowned, right?" No, I answered. I don't remember that. When did that happen? Back in the 70s, Terry informed me. I was still in high school. Well, I guess I never knew about it, I told him. I'm pretty sure that was here, said Terry. It was a sad thing and kind of weird. Weird, I asked him. How was it weird? Folks said they found him up on the bank, Terry said as he sipped his coffee. Okay, I said. What's so weird about that? He wasn't in the water. Okay, I shrugged it off. He was on the bank, Terry continued. If he drowned, why was he on the bank and not in the water? Well, maybe the wind blew him onto the shore, I was guessing. Or somebody moved him, Terry said. Well, why would anybody do that, I asked. Folks say he drowned, but he had been on the bank for a few days before he was found, Terry stated. Well, that is a bit weird, I admitted. Makes you wonder, Terry replied. I wanted to change the subject. I wonder if I should go check the bank lines. I got up and grabbed the lantern. Want me to go with you? Terry offered. Nah, you stay here and watch our rods, I told him. Maybe a big one will try to pull one in. Okay, Terry said. We'll trade off. You check the lines this time. I'll get the next turn. Deal, I agreed. Well, if you need help with the big one, Terry said as I moved down the bank. Will do. It was good and dark now, but the lantern provided a nice halo of light as I moved to our first bank line. There was no fish on it. The water dog was still alive and wiggling around. I moved to the next line. As I bent over the line and lifted the crawdad out of the water, I suddenly got an eerie feeling. The hair on my neck stood up. It felt like I was being watched. I lowered the bait back into the water and turned around. I held the lantern up high, trying to look back into the brush. I couldn't see anything. That damn story about the old man drowning on dry land had me spooked, I was thinking. I moved down the bank to the next line. I was about nearly to it when I heard a noise off to my left. I heard the brush pop. It was a sort of a rustling noise. Again, I held the lantern high and I looked back into the dark brush. I could see the tall bluff behind the brush and the trees, but I saw no movement in this tangle of brush. I continued to the next line. This time I heard a noise behind me as I checked the bait. It was a crunch, crunch, crunch. It sounded like footsteps. Had to be a raccoon, I told myself, or some other animal moving around back in the brush. The lantern light seemed feeble all of a sudden, and I wanted a better light because I could see nothing. And the crunching stopped when I turned around. What the hell? I thought to myself. I hurriedly checked the last lines. I heard the crunching noise behind and beside me in the brush every time I got to one of our lines. But I saw nothing, and we caught no fish. As I made my way back out, a passing thought occurred to me. What if Terry was messing with me? First he tells me this spooky story, then he follows me down here and he makes noises to scare me. But when I came around the small bend and topped the little rise, I had a clear view of Terry sitting at the campfire. He would have had to really hustle to get back to that point ahead of me. I walked on back to him. Terry looked up as I arrived. Anything, he asked? Nope. I shook my head. Nothing, and the bait was still on. I set the lantern down. How about you? He grinned. Look in the ice chest. He pointed at the big red and white ice chest we had with us. I opened the lid and looked inside. Inside was a nice 3-pound bass. Nice, I told him. What'd you catch him on? Your rod, he grinned again. The one with the crawdad. Cool. Well, I settled down and got a bit of coffee. I wanted to tell Terry about the noises I heard, but decided not to. I didn't want him to think I was spooked, and I still wasn't sure if he was behind the noises I heard, so I just didn't mention it. Well, a half hour or so later, Terry got up and picked up the lantern. My turn to check the bank lines, he announced. Okay, was my response. I'll watch the rods. I watched him until he disappeared around the small bend and over the rise. I wonder if we had a fish on any of the lines. I wondered if Terry was going to hear noises. While I wondered, I sat quietly and watched our rods. About 15 minutes later, I saw Terry coming back. When he got close enough, I could see he carried only the lantern. "Still nothing?" I asked, as he set the lantern down and took a seat. "Nope," he admitted, "bait's still hanging." "Damn," I grumbled. "I sure thought we'd catch something back there. Maybe we should move the lines to another spot." "We may need to," Terry said, "but let's leave them for a while yet." "Okay," I shrugged. "Any bites on the rods?" he asked me. "Nope," I told him, "not even a nibble." Terry just grunted, poured himself some coffee. I was watching Terry closely while pretending not to. I stared at the fire, but I watched him. I thought he looked a little bit off. He frequently looked in the direction of our bank lines. I wanted to ask him if he heard anything strange when he checked the lines, but I didn't. After a while, Terry suddenly blurted out, "You know, some folks say that old man Ghost haunts this place." I sat up straight and looked sharply at him. "Get out. Do you believe that crap?" "You don't?" he asked me. "Hell no," I said firmly. "But you're Catholic, aren't you?" he asked. "Well, yeah," I admitted. "What the hell does that have to do with anything? You know, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, isn't that a Catholic saying?" Terry asked like he explained everything. I rolled my eyes. "Dude, cut it out. I threw my cold coffee on the ground. You're killing me." Terry laughed. "Whatever, man. It's your turn to check the lines." Okay, I got up and grabbed the lantern. As I walked away, Terry called after me, "Watch out for the Holy Ghost." I just waved my middle finger at him and I walked away. I heard him chuckling. As I approached the first bank line, I was now convinced Terry was messing with me. Somehow, he was making the crunching noise I had heard. It had to be him, and I had just thought of a plan to prove it, providing I heard anything this trip. I reached the first bank line and I checked it. We had bait hanging and no fish. I heard nothing out of the ordinary. I was a bit relieved. The relief, however, was short-lived. I was halfway to the second line when I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch came the sound from the brush to my left. I didn't hold the lantern up to look around. Instead, I turned and sprinted back the way I'd come. I was going to catch Terry coming out of the brush. There must be another path back through the brush that he was using. I was younger and faster, and I had no doubt I could beat him back to the campfire. But when I came around the turn and up the rise, I stopped in shock, because I could clearly see Terry sitting at the campfire where I had just left him. There was simply no way he could move fast enough to get back there after making the noises I heard. Well, I was panting a bit. The sprint back and the adrenaline had me breathing hard. I retreated back down the rise just a bit. I stopped when I could just see him over the rise. I stood and I watched Terry, and I also kept a wary eye back down the bank toward our lines. I even looked to see if I could see where another path might be. I watched Terry get up and step forward to bend over one of our rods. He messed with it for a moment, probably tightening the line. Maybe it had a bite. But soon he returned to his seat. After a few more minutes, I started walking back towards Terry and the campfire. Terry put more wood on our fire, and I put the lantern down. "That didn't take long," Terry remarked. "Still nothing," I told him. Terry put another few pieces of wood on the fire and sat down. "See any holy ghosts?" he chuckled. I ignored him that time. "I'm going to check my bait," I said, and proceeded to reel up my two rods and check the bait. All was good, so I cast them both back out and sat back down. "Did you have any bites while I was gone?" I asked him. "Not sure," he admitted. "This one," he pointed at his rod, "had slack in the line, but I didn't see anything hit it." I nodded. That confirmed what I had observed, unbeknownst to him. Maybe I should check my bait too. I watched him while he reeled up, checked his bait, and cast it back out. After that, we just sat in silence. We watched our rods, we watched the fire, and we didn't talk. After a while, Terry stood up and stretched. "Well, this fire is making me sleepy," he said with a yawn. "I'm going to check the lines. If we don't have anything this time, we should move them." He grabbed up the lantern and walked down the bank. "Sounds good to me," I said, not knowing if he heard me. Terry was right, though. The fire was making me sleepy, too. We're out of coffee, so I got up and stretched. I walked to the edge of the firelight. I stared out at the pond, wondering where the fish were. After a few minutes, I sat back down. I saw Terry coming back. He seemed to be walking faster than normal. As he got to me in the fire, I could see he was upset. "That's it," he exclaimed. "You need to cut the shit." I looked at him. His eyes were wide and he was clearly agitated. "What?" I asked him. "You heard me," he fumed. "It's not funny. I don't know how you're doing it, but cut it out. It's not funny." "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked him, but I thought I knew. "Making noise back in the brush." I started to say. "It's not funny." Terry was hot. "I thought it was you," I told him. "Not funny," he exclaimed. "You heard noises too?" I asked at the same time. "Wait," Terry looked at me. "That wasn't you?" "Hell no," I admitted. "You never left the fire while I walked down there?" "Hell no," I said again. "I stayed right here." We stood looking at each other for a long moment. Then together we both looked down the bank where our bank lines were set. I think we were both thinking the same thing. What the hell? Terry turned to me. "You're not lying. That wasn't you." "I swear it wasn't me," I told him truthfully. "I heard stuff too. I thought it was you. I figured it had to be you, especially after that talk about the guy drowning and the ghosts." Terry shook his head. "I started talking that stuff because the first time I went back there I heard that shit and I thought it was you. So I thought I would creep you out so you would stop." Now I shook my head. "Exactly what did you hear?" I asked him. "Footsteps. Back in that crap. Stuff being stepped on," he explained. "What'd you hear?" "Same thing," I told him. "Footsteps crunching around back in the brush." "Maybe it's a cow," Terry said, or an ornery old bull. "Maybe. But I couldn't see it. I just heard it." "Tell you what," Terry offered. "Let's both go check the lines." "Okay," I agreed. "You take the flashlight," Terry told me. "I'll take the lantern." The flashlight was a weak little thing, but it was all we had beside the lantern. Together we set off down the bank. We arrived at the first line. Terry lifted the fishing line up, and sure enough, the bait was there. Just as he dropped it back into the water, we heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps, back in the brush. We both stood looking, Terry holding the lantern high while I aimed the flashlight back in there. We could see nothing. No movement, no shapes, nothing. I aimed the flashlight past us down the path, and as soon as I did, the crunching came again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Were those footsteps? And if so, footsteps of what? Terry and I now both knew it wasn't the other making those noises. "Why don't we pick up our lines and get out of here?" I suggested. "Good idea," Terry agreed. He reached down and pulled the bank pole out of the mud and rolled it up. He took the bait off the hook and tossed it into the pond. I kept scanning the brush with the flashlight. We moved down the trail to our next line. Terry pulled the pole out of the mud and started rolling it up. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sounds came to us again. I aimed the weak flashlight directly at the area I thought the sounds came from. For a moment, I thought I saw a vague shape of something. I was aware of Terry standing beside me. In the area where I thought I saw a shape, I saw what looked like two eyes. They were red. Red eyes in the dark and the shadows cast by our lights. Terry held the lantern higher. The eyes disappeared, or maybe they blinked. A few seconds later, the eyes were back. About 6 foot off the ground, and maybe 30 feet back in the brush, two red eyes looked at us. The eyes looked big. The eyes looked about 4 inches apart. "What the hell is that?" I asked softly. "I don't know," Terry said from beside me, "but it ain't no holy ghost. Let's get the hell out of here." I didn't argue with him. I didn't have to agree with him either. We both took off. We didn't run, but we walked at a brisk pace. And off to our right, in the brush, every few moments we could hear the footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Terry was in front with the lantern held high. We cleared the little rise and left the brush behind. In a few moments we were back at our dying campfire. We both turned back to where we saw the eyes. We stood looking for a moment. "Let's reel up and get the hell out of here," Terry suggested. "I'm for that," I agreed. We both reeled up the lines we had cast out. We kicked dirt onto the fire. I took all of our rods in hand, and now had both the lantern and the flashlight. Terry carried the ice chest and our bait bucket. We climbed the slope up to where the truck was parked. We left the tailgate down. I tossed the rods in the bed. I set the lantern on the tailgate and moved to the cab and started the truck and turned the headlights on. I went back to the tailgate. Terry had set the ice chest on the tailgate and opened it. "Where the hell's my fish?" he asked me. "It's not in there?" I asked him. "No." I grabbed the lantern and held it up, looking into the ice chest. That 3-pound bass was gone. "Did you turn my fish loose?" Terry was furious. "No, why would I do that?" "Well, it's gone." Terry threw his hands up. "Fish don't get out of ice chests and walk off on their own." "I swear to you, buddy, I did not turn your fish back. The last time I saw it was when you had me look at it. The only time when one of us was not near the ice chest was when we both left the fire to check on the bank lines. So if someone or something had been out there and got the fish out of the chest, it had to be then." We both turned to look back toward the pond. Our eyes traveled to the brushy area beneath the high bluff where we heard footsteps and saw red eyes. Forget it. Terry slammed the lid on the chest shut and pushed the box into the bed. He shut the tailgate. "Let's get back to town." I drove us toward the gate where we entered the pasture that held the pond. That had to be a big old bull, Terry reasoned. Do bulls' eyes glow red, I wondered aloud. By chance, as we neared the gate, we saw about a dozen cows. I swung the truck towards them and hit the high beams. Most of the steers lifted their head and looked at us. Their eyes all shined yellow. Yellow, not red. Okay, so not a bull, I reasoned. Terry didn't offer an opinion. I think he was still pissed that his fish was gone. "What about our bank lines?" I asked aloud. "Let's come out in the morning and get them," Terry suggested. "Okay," I agreed. "In the daylight," Terry added. "Sounds good," I agreed. "I'll come by about 7. "I'll be ready," Terry assured me. The next morning, I picked Terry up. We stopped and got a bite of breakfast, then headed out to the pond. I drove in and parked at the exact same spot as before. Terry raised his eyebrows at me as he watched me pull a shotgun out from behind the seat. "Just in case," I shrugged and jacked a shell into the chamber and clicked safety on. "Maybe we have some fish on the hooks after leaving them out here all night," Terry said hopefully. Together we walked down the slope to where our fire from the night before was. At the same time, we noticed our coffee pot and our cups. In our haste to vacate the premises, we had left them behind. Well, we'd both chuckled about that. We weren't chuckling, though, when we ventured down the bank to retrieve our bank lines. The brush beneath the high bluff on our left didn't seem nearly as foreboding as it had in the dark. We still could not see much back in there. We could see that there was water standing quite a ways back into the area. Funny that we didn't notice that last night. It was weird even. It got weirder. We did not have any fish on our hooks. All 3 of our bank lines we had left out were gone. We looked all around, but they were just gone. Someone or something had taken them. Speculation through the years that followed varied between Terry and myself. What made the footstep sounds? Were those red eyes really eyes? And if they were eyes, what was it? What happened to Terry's fish? What happened to our bank lines? Our speculation always started with rational explanations. Oh, it was an animal back in the brush. It was a deer. It was an owl in a tree. It was a raccoon or a possum in a tree. Did it have anything to do with the old man that drowned? Was the place haunted? Maybe someone, some guy or guys had been messing with us. They took the fish and the bank lines. Maybe some fellow happened upon the bank lines the same morning before we arrived back and took them. We wondered if maybe they had big fish on them. Maybe rational explanations were not the answer. Maybe the answer lay with the irrational. Or maybe, just maybe, something that stalked us in the brush was the culprit. Something that was really big and had big red eyes. The Thing in the Culvert by Rob Bauer. I've stated it many times, but it's true. I fish a lot. Fishing used to be an obsession with me. I was always looking for a place to wet a hook. These days, I fish lakes mostly. But back when I was in my 20s and my 30s, I fished creeks and rivers and farm ponds quite a lot. Maybe it's because they actually had water in them back then. Today, the drought's so bad that my old fishing holes have dried up. It's sad, really. This event took place back in the 80s, and back then there was water and fishing holes all over. So I was driving back country roads. I was stopping to fish a few places I knew of, and I was looking for new spots to fish. I drove into an area that I had only explored a few times. The area was like a long valley, and there was a nice creek running through the valley. There was a lot of trees, and the creek was on the north side of the road. Then it crossed under the road and was on the south side of the road. The creek wound its way back and forth under and over the road several times through this valley. There was one spot where the creek crossed the road at a low water crossing. The creek actually ran over the top of the road. The crossing had concrete poured through it to keep vehicles from getting stuck. At two other locations, the creek ran through concrete culverts. One culvert was split into two boxes. The boxes were big. They were around 8 foot tall and about 12 foot wide. Once when I was at this location, the creek was extremely high. The water was only about 3 foot from the top of the box. On this day, however, the creek level was more normal. The water looked to be about 18 inches, 2 foot deep, running through the boxes. The other culvert, it was also concrete, but it was only a single box. Now, a friend and I had more than once seined crawdads out of it. It was while seining crawdads out of that box that I learned that fish hung out inside these culverts. On hot summer days, fish stayed in or close to the shade that the box culverts provided. This particular day, it had been a hot one. It was now close to dusk. It got dark faster down in this here valley. And when the sun dropped below the horizon while you were in this valley, it created a twilight or a dusk effect. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't daylight either. This effect lasted for an hour or more sometimes. When I neared the big single box culvert, I pulled off the side of the road. I shut my truck off and gathered up my little spinning rod and reel rig. I had a small plastic worm rigged up, and I walked up to the culvert. I looked down into the water. I saw a few bass and a few perch cruising around. So I walked down the bank next to the wing wall, and when I got near enough, I flipped my plastic worm back into the culvert. I heard it plop into the water, and I couldn't see it hit the water because I held the rod out further than my line of sight allowed me to see back into the box. So I let the bait settle for a few moments, and then I began to twitch the plastic worm along the bottom. I soon had a bite. Well, I set the hook and I pulled out a nice little creek bass. It weighed maybe 1.5 pounds. I tossed the fish back in. I repeated the process, and I caught 3 more little bass like that. Now, after I had 5 or 6 unproductive casts, I moved to the other side of the road and caught 2 more little bass and 2 perch. Now, after a few more casts produced no hits, I decided that my fish left in the box were wise to me. It was time to move to the double box down the road. Okay, so I drove the half mile or so to the big double box and again stopped well back from the culvert. With my rod, my reel in my hand, I walked down the road to the box. I stood on the head wall of the box and I looked down into the water. It was dark enough now, especially on the eastern side of the box, that I couldn't see any fish. But I walked about 3/4 of the way down the wing wall and flipped my worm back into the box with a kind of a sidearm, almost an underhand cast. I heard that 1/4 ounce worm weight bounce off the concrete wall of the box and ricochet into the water. So I flipped the bail on my spinning reel and then I took up the slack, just like you do. I waited a few moments and I twitched the worm. I took up the slack in the line, twitched it again. The line grew heavy. I had something. I set the hook with a sharp jerk of the rod. Whatever I had hooked, it didn't move. I pulled a few more times. Whatever I had hooked still didn't move. Crap, I thought. I was hung up. I must be hung up on a tree limb or something else washed into the box. So I moved down the wing wall a few more steps to change the angle and snapped my line a few more times to try to get the hook free. My line was very tight, tighter than it should have been. In fact, I noticed the drag was pulling away. Something was pulling slowly on my line. Whatever I had hooked was pulling away from me towards the opposite end of the box. So I tightened my drag a few more clicks and I pulled back. I heard a sort of a splash. The splash wasn't loud. Then I heard what sounded like a grunt. A grunt? I wondered what the heck I'd hooked. Suddenly, the line started pulling harder. I was really losing line off my reel now. So I tightened my drag some more, and that made my rod bend a lot more. I heard 2 more splashes, and my rod jerked. My rod jerked hard. I had to grip my rod with both hands. What the hell? Then my line snapped. The now slack line fell into the water. It was then that I heard more splashes. Splash, 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 splash. It sounded like footsteps, really. Footsteps in the water, you see, moving away from me. Actually, it sounded like running footsteps in the water. Well, I moved back up the wing wall of the culvert. The splashes continued as I moved up the wall. I heard whatever this was leave the box culvert. The sound of the splashes changed once it left the box. I was high enough to see over the road, but not high enough to see down to the creek. Now, as I moved up the wing wall, I caught sight of something. It was just dark enough to keep me from getting a good view of it. I saw a dark shape moving away from me towards the trees along the creek bank, and I heard the splash, splash, splash of the footsteps in the water turn into thud, thud, thud of the footsteps on land as it left the water of the creek. I saw the dark shape hit the trees along the bank. Then the dark shape went through the trees. I heard and I saw it go through the trees. It broke branches as it went. The thing left a wake behind it. And then it was gone. Well, I walked up the wing wall and across the road. I stood looking at where that thing had plowed through the willows and the tamaracks. I could just make out its path. The vegetation kind of closed up behind it, but I could see broken limbs hanging. What the hell was that, I wondered. Well, I reeled up my snapped fishing line and I walked the short distance to my truck. I put the rod in the truck and got out my pistol and a flashlight. Now, after several strange encounters in the past, I decided to carry a weapon when I could. At first, I carried a .22 pistol or a .22 rifle, but I soon upgraded to bigger weapons. I carried a shotgun with buckshot or slugs, sometimes both, or a .44 Magnum pistol. On this night, I had the .44 Magnum pistol. The pistol, it was a Ruger Super Blackhawk with an 11-inch barrel. I loaded the pistol and I moved back to the box culvert. I aimed my flashlight at the trees where I'd last seen this thing. I couldn't see anything. It was dark enough now. I couldn't see well without the flashlight, but not dark enough to see much with it. I was curious. I wanted to know what this thing was. So I crossed the length of the culvert and went down the ditch on the side where this thing had disappeared. I had to cross a fence to access the point where this thing went through the trees. So I made my way down the creek bank to the point where this thing had exited the water. Shining my light around, I could see some broken branches. I could also see some depressions in the grass. The grass was about a foot high there, and I could see 4 spots where the thing must have stepped. I looked at the water's edge. I was hoping to find a track in the mud, but I found a spot where a foot had slipped as the thing came up out of the water. It looked odd to me. I bent down for a better look. I could see 3 gouges in the mud bank. The gouges were, they were about 8 inches long and about 2 inches apart. Were they toes? I began to get an eerie, uneasy feeling. I stepped back up the bank and looked at the depression in the grass. Starting at the first one, I stepped up beside it and stepped to the second one. I came up short. Whatever this thing was, it had long legs. Its stride was much longer than mine. It took me a full stride and a half a stride to match it. Even running, that's a long step. I had to leap from spot to match the stride. Then I noticed something else. I noticed some broken branches. Now, these branches were broken a foot above my head. 3 toes, a long stride, 7 foot tall. What the hell was it? Well, the hair on my arms and my neck stood up. My first thought was a deer. So I'd been thinking deer all along, but this was no deer. The shape I saw was dark but indistinct. I realized when I had replayed it in my mind that there were no antlers on the head I saw, and no doe ever lived to get this big. What I saw was a shape. Maybe a head, maybe shoulders, maybe it was a man. Well, a very big man. But if it was a man, why didn't he say something? Why would he just run off like that? And what was he doing in that box culvert? Was the splash, splash, splash I heard, was that the sound of bipedal footsteps? Was it Was it really on two legs, or was it some four-legged creature leaping from spot to spot, creating a bipedal stepping sound? Well, I whipped around and aimed my flashlight into the box. From this side and this angle, I could see about 3/4 through the box closest to me and about halfway through the box that the thing ran out of. What I saw in my flashlight beam only added to the mystery. Inside the box that the thing ran out of sat a lawn chair. A lawn chair? That's what it was. One of those chairs that folds up for storage. Well, the chair sat leaning against the far wall of the box. The water came up to about 4 inches under the seat. Again, I thought, what the hell? Had he, be it a man or a beast, been sitting in that chair? Had I hooked him with my worm hook? Why was this chair even there? Was it a homeless man taking a bath or living in the box? Could it have been a man hiding out in the box? If it was a man, he was one big dude. And what about that track? Did whatever had ran out of the box make that track? Or was it made before and by something else? All I had was questions. Suddenly another question came to mind. Where was it now? I looked around me. It was full dark now. I noticed something else right then, too. I noticed how quiet it was. It was dead silent. I couldn't hear any insects buzzing or chirping. I didn't hear any frogs. I didn't hear any coyotes. It was unnatural. And I was all alone. I was suddenly very glad I had the big pistol. Whoever or whatever this was could be watching me, maybe hiding out until I left, so he or it could return to the lawn chair, or maybe waiting for a chance to jump me. I decided to get the hell out of there. I was most anxious when crossing over the fence, but I made it over quickly. I walked the road over the culvert back to my truck. I started the truck, and with my headlights on bright beams, I drove slowly over the culvert. I saw nothing. I saw no shapes. I saw no eye shines. I'm not sure I wanted to see anything. 2 evenings later, I returned to the culvert. The lawn chair was gone. Was it moved? Had it washed away by the creek? I guess I will never know. Bigfoot in Colorado by Rob Bowers. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the hairy man. It is known by many names around the country. Thousands of people claim to have seen it. This alleged creature is also known by many regional names. I'm partial to some of the names generated close to my area of the country. The Fouke Monster, the Oakwood Gorilla, the Caddo Critter, the Noxie Monster, the Howley Him, the Lake Worth Monster. These monikers are some of my favorites. I didn't believe in such things back in 1986. Oh, I'd seen a few movies. The Legend of Boggy Creek and The Creature from Black Lake come to mind, but they were just movies. They were simply make-believe stories to frighten teenagers at drive-in theaters. Now, I am not claiming to have actually seen anything, because I did not. But what happened one September night in 1986 forever altered my thoughts and perspectives on the subject. To be frank and honest, this event scared the heck out of me. 4 of us went trout fishing and camping in the mountains of Colorado. To this day, I'm not exactly sure where we were. I tried to find the spot again, but I never did. The 4 of us consisted of my aunt and her friend, my cousin, and myself. I followed my aunt to the spot. All I can say for sure about the location is we went west of Denver and then north. To be honest, I paid little attention. I just followed my aunt. Well, we wound up on a paved county road. The road curved at one point. On the outside of the curve was a roadside park. There was a few trash barrels there and 3 concrete picnic tables. Across the road was a small river or creek. We set up camp, which consisted of erecting 2 tents and unloading our stuff, and then we went fishing in the stream across the road. This location was just beautiful. Directly behind the roadside park, the mountain we were on sloped down, and you could see another mountain behind it. I guess there was a valley down between. We caught a nice mess of brook trout. My aunt and her friend cooked them up for supper, and it was just the best. While we were fishing, 2 other vehicles stopped at the park and set up camp. A man and a blonde woman set up a tent just down from us, and both of them fished, and I saw them catch a few trout. Then a pickup with a slide-in camper arrived, and I saw a man, a woman, a little girl about 10 years old milling about. Not long after dark, we all crawled into our tents. I was worn out, and I was fast asleep soon. I'm not sure how long I slept, but at some point I woke to my cousin shaking me. What? I was groggy and irritated. What is it? I didn't like being shaken awake. Listen, he sound rattled. I sighed deeply and listened. I didn't hear anything. I told him so. I don't hear anything. Go to sleep, I told him. No, listen, he insisted. Then I heard a loud crack. There, my cousin said. Keep listening. I heard another loud crack. Then I heard a series of maybe 4 thumps. Crack, thump, 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 thump. That's odd, I thought. After a few moments, the sound repeated. Crack, thump, thump, thump. Okay, now I was wide awake. Those cracks and those thumps sounded several more times. What the heck, I wondered aloud. It's been going on for like 10 minutes, my cousin told me. A part of my brain tried to rationalize what we were hearing. Could it be a limb breaking off a tree and rolling down the slope? Maybe, but what broke the limb? Then we heard a loud, deep grunt. Ruh. That's the best I can phonetically describe the grunt. Ruh. The grunt came again. There was no branch or limb. Something made that sound. Something alive. Crack. Thump, thump, thump. Then we heard something moaning. It sounded like something in pain. The moaning lasted for 15-20 seconds, and then it was loud. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the little park, down the slope, and maybe in the hidden valley below. The sound echoed all through the area. Crack, thump, 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 thump. Were we hearing the footsteps of whatever was making the grunts and the moaning? Was it getting closer? I couldn't tell. Then another sound started. At that time, I could only describe it as jibber-jabber. My cousin and I huddled in our tent and listened to this surreal noise. I can't accurately spell out what these sounds sounded like. I can only do my best to describe them. The jibber-jabber sounded like a very big man speaking a foreign language, mixed in with growls and sounds that an ape might make. And they were so loud, you could almost feel them as well as hear them. There was power behind those uncanny vocalizations. I had enough. I crawled to the front of the tent and started unzipping it. What are you doing? My cousin grabbed me. You can't go out there. I got a gun in my truck, I told him, and I'm going to go get it. I unzipped the tent flap and crawled outside. I had a .44 Magnum pistol in my truck, and I wanted to feel its cold steel and walnut grips in my hand. Thinking back, I guess it was dumb leaving my pistol in the truck. It was very dark. I could barely see anything. I took a few steps towards where I thought I remembered my truck was parked and stopped. My cousin walked into the back of me, nearly giving me a heart attack. What are you doing? I asked him angrily. You aren't leaving me in that tent by myself, he told me. I'm going with you. Okay, I told him while nodding, even though he couldn't see me. Come on, I think it's this way. I moved slowly. My cousin was practically glued to my back. Ahead, I saw a glint of starlight off a windshield. There were the vehicles. I made my way to my truck. I found the door handle on the passenger side and I pulled. The door was locked. I panicked for a moment. I didn't remember locking my truck. I was digging in my pockets for keys when I heard another sound. It sounded like metal hitting glass, metal hitting my side window. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face to the glass. I could just barely make out a figure inside. It was my aunt. She was in my truck with the door locked, and the metal on glass sound was the sound of the barrel of my pistol hitting the glass. My aunt and her friend had locked themselves in my truck, found my pistol, and my aunt was just a moment away from shooting me. I jerked backwards and threw my hands up. Stop, I yelled. Don't shoot, it's us. The window came down about 3 inches. Let us in, my cousin implored him. The door unlocked and my aunt jumped out. I folded the seat forward and we crawled into the back. Get your asses in here, my aunt's friend told us. Once inside, my aunt re-entered and shut the door, locking it once again. You don't know how close I came to shooting you, my aunt told us. I had a pretty good idea after looking down the barrel of my hand cannon. I was normally on the other end of my massive pistol. How long have you ladies been in here? I asked them. At least half an hour, my aunt replied. What is making those noises? My aunt's friend asked me. I don't know, I answered honestly, but it's big and it's pissed off. And the thing or things were still carrying on. I was starting to think there was more than one animal out there in the dark. I thought maybe there were at least two somethings out there, and they were communicating with this jibber-jabber noises. I think there is more than one critter out there, I voiced my thoughts. Maybe so, my aunt still cradled the pistol. I've never heard anything like that before. I thought about asking for my pistol, but then I thought it was fine in my aunt's possession. She was probably a better shot than me anyway. It sounds like an ape, my cousin chimed in, or a big monkey. I know, I agreed with him, but out here that didn't make no sense. It did not make sense. But something was out there, and it was big, it was weird, and maybe mad at another thing just like it. Maybe it was mad at us for being there. We had no way of knowing. We just stayed in the truck all night. Now, at some point, the noise died down and it finally stopped. We had no way of knowing if the thing or the things had left, or if they wanted us to think they'd left, so we stayed in the truck. I have to say, my back seat was not very comfortable, but we felt a lot safer in the truck than in those tents. And I think we all slept a little, but not much. When it was good and light out, I told my aunt to let me out because I had to relieve myself. The mountain air was crisp and it was clean. I walked through the little park and down the slope just far enough to be out of sight. Took care of my business. I looked all around the area. I saw nothing. I saw no footprints. I saw no freshly broken branches, and I saw no weird critters. I didn't hear anything unusual either. Whatever it was, it must have gone, and good riddance. I walked back up the slope and saw my aunt's friend, and my cousin moving about outside the truck. I looked over where the other folks' camps were at. The couple and the other tent were taking it down. The family with the slide-in camper were loading stuff up, like they were all preparing to leave. I walked over to the couple with the tent. Before I could even say good morning, the blonde lady asked me if I'd heard anything strange during the night. Yeah, we did. We slept in my truck because it had us so rattled, I told her. Any idea what it was? The man whirled around and said, not a clue, but we weren't staying here another night. I think we're leaving too, I told him. I said goodbye to them and walked down to the family with the camper. We're getting the heck out of here too, the man said before I could ask. I thought they were coming into camp, the lady said. They? I raised my eyebrows. There were two of them, the man said with confidence. One was down there, and he pointed behind us and down the slope. And the other one was over that way. He pointed down and away to the right. It was Bigfoot, the little girl suddenly added to the conversation. I opened my mouth to ask her about that, but her mother put an abrupt end to the conversation. You hush up, her mother scolded. Get in a pickup. They all loaded up and they left. I walked back to our area. The others had everything broke down and loaded up. Let's go, my aunt said, obviously ready to leave. Well, what about breakfast? I questioned. We'll eat later, she said. And that settled it. We left. We did find another place to stop. We ate and fished and camped there. I kept the 44 in the tent with me this time. But nothing bothered us. The fishing wasn't as good as the first place, but the night was a lot quieter. My aunt would never talk much about that night. As the years passed, I thought about that night many times. What was the creature out there in the dark? Was there more than one? Was it a Bigfoot, like the little girl said? And what made her think that? I had so many questions and too few answers. Like I've said, I'm a curious man. I wanted answers. Bigfoot seemed like the most logical answer to the most illogical event. What we heard that night was not any animal normally found in the mountains. I read every book I could ever find on the subject of Bigfoot. I watched TV programs like In Search Of. I watched every movie I could find. I learned what I could. Back then things were different. There was no internet. There weren't TV shows on every night devoted to the subject of Bigfoot. There was no YouTube. Information was a lot harder to find. But I learned what I could. I still wasn't sure what had scared us that night. When the internet happened, I found a veritable goldmine of information. Some information was good. Some info sounded like outright crazy bull hockey to me. And then one night, I heard about some guys who had an alleged Bigfoot recording. The sounds were recorded in the Sierra Mountains in 1972. I think. The sounds were described as samurai chatter, but the program didn't play the sounds. I quickly went to YouTube and searched. I found several recordings of the alleged Bigfoot sounds recorded in the Sierras. I listened and my blood ran cold. One recording in particular took me right to that dark night in 1986. It wasn't exactly what we'd heard, but it was very, very close. I now think we did hear a Bigfoot that night, possibly two of them. What else could it have been? Can I prove it? Nah, we didn't see anything. So if you listen to the Sierra recordings, you'll get a sampling of what we heard that night. Sounds that defy explanation. In the dark night, the sounds echoed and reverberated through the whole area. Sounds that made us feel like small little animals huddling together for safety. Terrifying sounds from the darkness. I never camp without a firearm now. There are things out there in the dark night, unexplained things that howl and scream and jibber jabber. What are they? I don't know. But I hope to find out someday.
We hope you have enjoyed tonight's compilation of Rob Bowers stories. Don't forget to check out his Campfire Tales books on Amazon. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Corners.